Well, good morning and welcome to a FS Club Community Chest, where we chat to one of the people in our community about what life is like and what's going on. And today I'm simply delighted to have Bim Afolami, a member of Parliament whom I respect quite a bit actually, and I've always enjoyed my conversations with Bim as a thoughtful conservative. And of course, what could be possibly more interesting in the United Kingdom at the moment than to chat to somebody who is an MP in government with an independent and thoughtful view. I might also point out, go a little easy on him. Remember, he's not responsible for everything the Conservative Party has done. And secondly, Bim has flown back in from Uganda just late last night, so he's also a little jet lagged. But he has kindly agreed to talk to us today about why politics is all about economics, not culture. Now, you'll know me, I'm Michael Mainelli. I'm one of the directors of CN, and it really is a privilege to be able to introduce so many of these webinars, but we can only do so thanks to the tolerance, generosity, and wide interests of our supporting community of sponsors whom you see here before you. Now, today's format is going to be one that those of you who are in FS Club will find familiar, but before we do all of that, we'd just like to ask you a quick poll question. And that question is up here before you. Is politics all about economics or culture? Where should Bim be headed on this? Now, Bim, we've got a lot of people online, and one of the great things about this audience is that they are fast on their opinions and fast on the buzzers. Over three-quarters of the audience have voted already. I'll leave it open just for another second or two, and we're ready to show the vote here. So have a quick look. And there you go. So running at exactly 50-50. So we'll see where this heads, Bim. If you can convince them it's all about economics and not culture, you've got half the audience to move. So moving back to the agenda, we're going to have a look today at firstly Bim's thoughts on is politics all about economics and not culture. We will turn to you, the audience, and ask for your opinions and what you think about things. Please do remember three items. One, this presentation is being recorded and it will be available in about sometime, I think, Sunday. Secondly, please do use the GoToWebinar question and answer facility. All of your emails, questions, comments, contributions, etc., will be sent to Bim with your email attached. So if you want to get hold of him privately or point out something to him, we will make sure that he gets all of that after the broadcast. And Bim, just before you get going, Trevor Hilder pips in, and I'm sure you're probably going to cover this in your remarks, but surely politics is about both and plus a lot more. Thank you, Trevor. Anyway, Bim, the floor at the moment is yours. Why is politics all about economics and not culture?
Great, thank you. And thank you so much, Michael. It's a pleasure to be here and to join you all. To answer very directly the point that just came, of course, politics is about a whole bunch of things. But the reason why I wanted to frame my remarks in this way is that I think overwhelmingly everything comes downstream of economics. So what I mean by that is that, particularly culture, what happens to people's view of their economic position determines, in my view, politically, how they interpret everything else. And that is what I mean by saying politics is all about economics, not culture. And let me explain a little bit about that. It's also, you will all appreciate that I thought of this long before the current sort of market movements and disasters that we're currently having at the moment in Britain. So this is not primarily a talk at all about, you know, the budget or anything like that. This is really a more broader ranging set of remarks. So why I think politics is all about economics and not culture or not anything else is that throughout human history, but let's think specifically about modern democratic or modern political history. And I'm talking from a Western viewpoint, I should probably add, whether it be Britain, the United States, France, Germany, etc. Human beings' awareness of their own status is determined largely by how they perceive their status to be economically, not, and obviously you may say, well, there are aristocracies. There were, in class-ridden societies, there'll be this person is a higher social class than this person. And that is true, but actually, the reason why those things are there and mattered historically is because of those people's economic position, not because of any inherent, people thought they had sort of any inherent nobility or virtue. And critically, over time, when people were able to traverse classes, to move between classes, they were only able to do that when their economic positions changed. So let me talk about this more in the modern day. Some of you will be listening to this thinking, well, this is nonsense. Who is this guy? Because when I speak to people about their political views, or when I read articles, or even myself, or even yourself, you may say, I want to vote for a party of social justice. I don't care about my economic position. Or I like to, the thing I care about is crime and tackling crime. And now that's not primarily an economic judgment. That's, yeah. So it is clearly true that overall, human beings understand what you might describe as cultural issues better than they understand economic ones, because they are frankly easier to grasp for all of us, and it's easier to discuss and explain. So people definitely use cultural language as a way of explaining why they are doing things or why they are not doing things, or why they support somebody or why they don't support somebody. But it tends, that cultural description of where they are tends to be derived from an economic one. And how I'm going to try and prove this to you, where you're all probably thinking I'm speaking complete nonsense, is to talk about two particular issues that you're seeing in modern Western politics. One is the more educated people in society are now voting in a much more left-wing way than they ever have before. And the second is that, and I'm going to be quite careful about this second one, white working class citizens in Western communities are voting in a more right-wing way than they used to before. And through looking at these two, and these are two things that are commonly described as cultural effects, but actually they are, in my view, economic effects. And let me describe why. So let's talk about the higher educated. Now, the great thing is that we've got a lot of data for this, because we know you can track how many people have degree, how many people have A levels or equivalent, how many people have bachelor's degrees, postgraduates, and you can track their voting intentions. It's actually, we've got a very good set of data. In the United States, in 1960, when John F. Kennedy won the presidency, he won 1/3 of college-educated voters. In 2020, when Joe Biden won the presidency, he won just over 2/3 of highly educated voters. I'm saying highly educated, by the way, as people who have college degrees, bachelor degrees or above. In the 2019 general election in Britain, 50% of those who had a degree or above voted Labour, and 32% voted Conservative. If you go back to the 1979 general election, which was Margaret Thatcher's first general election win, those numbers were pretty much reversed. It's a very similar thing to what happened in the United States. So why is this? I think it's basically, there are two principal reasons, which are economic reasons, which is why graduates are trending to the left in a way that they did not in the past. The first is that the graduate premium, so the extra earnings that you gain, or earn, should I say, from going to university are lower now than they have ever been. Let me take two dates. If you take the year 1970 in Britain, the graduate premium, which is the extra amount that you earn from getting a degree compared to the same person who didn't get a degree, in 1970 that premium was 28%. In 2020 that premium was 13%. And I'll give you that stat for the United Kingdom. I didn't see it. I couldn't find the stat for the United States, but it wouldn't surprise me if those numbers were broadly similar to some degree in the United States, because we have similar levels of higher education participation. So I would posit to you that, in effect, what is happening to a lot of graduates is they have done the right thing. They've done what their mummy and daddy have told them to do. They've worked hard. They've taken their degrees. And they get to the job market, and it just isn't meeting their expectation level in terms of earning, the type of job they can get, etc. There's another reason for that, of course, which is we have way more graduates now than we used to. You know, in the 60s, 70s, even the 80s, the percentage of people going to university, you know, didn't get beyond, say, 20%. Now you're reaching almost 50% of people, young people going to university. So it may just be, I mean, they're very complicated reasons why the graduate premium is lower, but one of them is probably just pure numbers. You've just got a much greater number of people going to university now, and that has suppressed the extra wages people can earn. So I think that when you have a graduate premium that is lower than what you expect, this takes me to my second point. On top of that, people are having to pay a lot more to go to university today than they did in the past. So in effect, your graduate premium is lower, and yet you're having to pay a lot more for it than you used to. You put those two things together, economically, it would lead, in my view, a lot more of those voters to say, I'm going to vote for the party that is going to spend more money on people like me. And therefore, broadly speaking, the centre-left will do that more than the centre-right because of the economic philosophy, broadly difference between the centre-left and centre-right in almost all Western countries. And so it's an economic decision for those people to trend left, though if you read a lot of the commentary, they'll say, oh, it's because they believe in, you know, they're all lefty tutors at university and they're persuading them to vote Labour or Democrat or whatever. And I'm not saying those things aren't there. I'm just making the point that actually human beings are quite capable of making their own decisions, irrespective of whatever atmosphere they're in at university or whatever. And I think they're making an economic choice, which is economically, I need more support having been a graduate compared to a graduate of, say, 40 or 50 years ago. That is why I think graduates are trending to the centre left. Let me take a second example, which is the one around white, predominantly working class voters in multi-ethnic societies like the UK or the US, and why they're voting in a more right-wing fashion, so the opposite of the graduates. We've seen this recently, obviously, with the vote for Brexit. We saw that with the Republicans in the US. I say the Republicans rather than Trump, because notwithstanding Donald Trump's idiosyncrasies, what's happening is that the sort of voter who is voting, who's very strong supporter of Trump in these sort of what Americans call these left behind areas in the Midwest and the South, they are also voting for the Republicans. It's not like these are voters who otherwise really wanted to vote Democrat but for Trump. They have become Republican voters, and it's similar in many places in the UK, though in the UK it's a bit less pronounced. And the reason, I think, a big part of the reason for this, for white voters in multi-ethnic societies trending in this way, and you can get this from a lot of polling over the last few years, was there was a considerable concern about immigration. Now, I happen to think that it's perfectly rational to be concerned about immigration. You have everybody, there are finite resources. There are a lot of social tensions that come along with immigration. If you live in a rural area, you don't want your rural areas to become a town. If you live in a town, you don't want all the services to be eaten up. There are very, very rational reasons why someone should care about immigration and not want too many immigrants. And following on from that, I think that is the reason why immigration played such a big role over the last 10 years. It's economics. It's about resources. It's about money. It's not about racism predominantly. That's not to say there are not racist people. Of course there are. But what you'll find is you'll find racist people at all levels of the social or economic spectrum. In effect, what you've seen with the concern about immigration is not just difficulties about resources, because the fewer resources that you have as a working class voter in your society, the fewer resources that you have, obviously, the more concerned you are about other people sharing them, whereas richer voters care a bit less about that because they've got so much more to go around. But the second is that the sort of jobs that you do are precisely the jobs where wages have been held down over the last 30 years due to globalization predominantly. So people often mischaracterize the immigrants moving in and saying, oh, these immigrants are, even if it's not stealing my jobs, they're keeping the salaries down in, for example, being an electrician or being a plumber or other sorts of working, traditional working class occupations. And though there are some examples where that can happen in very small pockets, you know, if you get 100 people turn up to one particular town who all have the same skill, then if you're doing that, if you're in that town with that skill, obviously you're going to be impacted, and it's important to recognize that. But mostly that doesn't happen. But what effectively happens is that because of the integration over the last 40 years of China into the world economy, manufacturing moving to the East, first China, now lots of other places as well in the East, has meant that that sort of job in the West, that working class, traditional, skilled, manual job, has become less and less profitable to the extent for the people that do them. And there are fewer jobs because so many more of those jobs are going overseas. And the visible manifestation of that has been through physically seeing immigrants from somewhere else. And so people are sort of saying, well, I don't like immigration because of A, B, and C. They may describe, oh, I don't like, you know, if there are sort of nativist attitudes expressed, often that's actually a reflection of an economic concern rather than just a pure cultural, oh, I don't like them because they look different or whatever. So if you take these two things that are current trends in our politics, educated voters behaving certain ways, less educated in terms of degrees, voters, working class voters behaving in different ways, I think those are things that are driven by economics, not culture. And I just finish by simply talking a little bit about where we are now, because it'd be remiss of me just to completely ignore it. My view is that what is happening is a very painful shift that should probably have happened since after the financial crisis, to away from a world where money is incredibly cheap to one where debt is going to be less plentiful and it's going to be more expensive. And through that, as a consequence of that, I would expect even more focus on economics, even more focus on money than we have had over the last 10 years. This trend is going to continue. And all those interested in politics, the parties and the politicians that will be able to steer us through this are the ones that are able to provide the answers to these economic problems and concerns. You are not going to, we're not going to make progress as a society, or indeed, I don't think you're going to win elections on an enduring basis if you don't deal with those economic problems and think that all I need to do is talk about cultural issues and people will vote for me because these days politics is all about culture. I think if you deal with the economics, people will be happier, you'll win elections, and it will all be better. So that's my talk. They're my remarks. Thank you for having me. Answer any questions.
Thank you, Bim. And actually, there are a lot of questions, so we're going to tuck into them. Whilst you were chatting, I tried to have a look to see about the US graduate premium. It's slightly more complex than here, not quite as simple, because the way that they focus on high school graduates and some of the numbers there. But you know, definitely this graduate premium element is definitely a driver. Just to get things going, we have a question here from Bob McDowell. Do graduates have more of a guilt complex about the weaker members of society and the endless news about inequalities?
Yeah, I've thought about this a lot. I mean, my sense is actually it depends what graduates. So, and there is a difference, right? So there are, I mentioned the graduate premiums lower, etc. There are very, very successful graduates where their graduate premium is very high. And they're very happy with all the decisions they made, and they don't mind paying back high student debt because they're doing very well. When you're dealing with successful graduates, I think there can be a bit of a guilt on the basis of their fortune, but more often than not, and I've got no data of this, this is just anecdotal, I think that actually today's graduate elite is much less guilt-ridden than a couple of generations ago, where they really felt a bit more of a commitment to helping their fellow man. You look at charitable donations were higher, people volunteered more in local communities for the church, for scouts, for all this sort of stuff. And the reason, in my view, is that in the past, they knew how lucky they were. There were so few of them went to university, so few people had the sort of parents who could give them, who had the status and could really help them in that sort of way. So they knew that they were very lucky. I think in the modern day, there is a tendency of successful graduates to think, I'm here because I'm brilliant. Why do I need to give anybody anything else? So unsuccessful graduates, either people who don't feel they got a good deal, I think they actually, rather than guilt, I think there's a big resentment against the whole system, really. And I think that will play its way out in the next election in Britain and the United States as well. It's one of the reasons why I think Joe Biden forgave $10,000 of student debt. You know, I think that was smart politics. Whether it's smart economics is another question.
It's quite interesting. I wasn't expecting the audience to take this turn, but it's a very much a turn through a lot of the comments about culture being positive and economics being negative. Let me pick up here with John Knights. Now, John just immediately came back on your comments there. Why does helping our fellow man have to be associated with guilt? But he goes on, the overall approach that you've had, the theory seems to be based on the assumption that everyone or most votes based on self-interest. Isn't self-interest the driver for economics, which has been the priority, whereas altruism or ideology are the drivers of culture change? You know, what does this say about the human race and the future of the planet? So I think in short, John is saying, isn't economics the driver of self-interest and culture the driver of more altruistic thinking?
It's a fascinating question. I do think that most people, and everybody's smart enough to realize I'm generalizing, of course, when you're dealing at this level. I think most people do vote in their perceived self-interest. Yes, I do. It's almost the basis on which democracy operates. That's why when politicians go to election, they say, look at the things I'm going to do for this constituency, this area, this city, whatever it is, because people do primarily vote on their self-interest. In relation to culture, and the site, I suppose I'd frame it as the type of society or type of country that you want to see. I think that where people tend to vote on those grounds are two reasons. One is where they feel materially comfortable enough that that stops being a driver for them. And there are lots of examples of that. It's one of the reasons why, you know, the church has always had given, or at least traditionally, the vicars always had a very nice place to live. It wasn't just a status thing. It was so that they didn't think about money and that they were focused entirely on helping their parishioners and spreading the word of God. I actually think that when people go, I care about my fellow man, often it's amazing how often those solutions tend to benefit them as well, right? So yes, we'll give you a very practical example. People's concern about the NHS is very, very low until, broadly, they have one child. and then their interest and concern about NHS spending and how it runs and everything goes through the roof because they use it.
Got an interesting one here from Donald McCrae. How do you explain the Brexit vote if politics is all about economics?
Oh, very easily. Because, I mean, you basically had a vote like Brexit is really you have a coalition of two groups. You have traditional, small c conservative, relatively affluent suburban or rural voters for whom sovereignty and independence and the nation are critical political drivers. These were people who are not liberals, put it that way, in any shape or form. And then secondly, you have a group of people that I was describing who typically used to vote to the left, your traditional Labour, white working class union family, for example. And I think this was primarily viewed through the prism of immigration, though I would stress again, this is not saying that it's in any way weird to be concerned about immigration. But I think the reason why a lot of these people were concerned about immigration is they saw the change in their communities and they saw their economic circumstances decline. And if someone's saying, well, here's a way of changing the country that's quite big and fundamental, then I think you'll go for it on the basis that, you know, it might improve my material circumstances. I don't think they were looking at people saying, oh, I just want to get rid of them because I don't like what they look like or where they're from. I don't think it's that at all. I think it was a perception of their own self-interest. In many respects, by the way, accurately, the returns to labour in the economy have actually increased in certain ways since Brexit, because I think a lot of people accurately thought, well, if there are fewer Europeans, then in a particular segment, then I'll probably earn more money and people like me will earn more money. And where you have skill shortages, those people will probably have been proved correct. Now, that's not to say all of them voted for Brexit, far from it. But, you know, I think that people are pretty good at assessing their own self-interest. And even if they don't always explain it in that way.
Hugo Innes has made a point that he's seen a similar argument by David Sachs in the US, framing this as the graduate elite versus the working class, and points out that David Sachs says basically there are more working class folks than there are graduate elite folks, so it becomes a good argument for populism. Which I think is there. And Trevor Hilder, who opened up the discussion today, wonders, you know, is all of this related to software eating the world, whereby safe professional jobs are now starting to get taken over by artificial intelligence and related software systems?
I have to plead that my knowledge of artificial intelligence isn't what it should be. And it's one of the things that I want to improve over the coming weeks and months. But what I am tempted to say is that I think you are right, but for not quite the reason why you think you're right. It's not so much software eating the world, it's educated people in the third world eating the jobs of Western graduates.
Yeah.
A friend of mine who I saw in Uganda, who supports this charity that I was at, that's why I was there, he was explaining the difference in what a software engineer gets paid in India, the United States, Europe, Britain, comparing that, because he runs lots of software businesses and he was comparing how much they get paid. He was explaining to me how he's in the process of moving way more of his software capability to India, because he said, I can get people who are just as good, if not better, for about half the cost. And I said, what about other people at your level, you know, people who run businesses like you? He said, this is what we talk about all the time. Why should you, if you don't physically have to be somewhere, then why would you go to a high cost location rather than being in a low cost one? And I think that people are just starting to see that the work from home revolution in particular, though very positive in lots of ways, we've got to be careful we don't take it too far, because if somebody insists on working from home from Hitchin for, say, their multinational in London, then maybe that multinational says that they can employ someone in Hyderabad as well.
Yeah. And actually, we are seeing a lot of that. One of the interesting things I've noticed is that London is an intense commuter-dependent city. Actually, rather unusually, even on a global basis, in the sense that we drop over 500,000 people on the square mile every day in normal circumstances pre-COVID. And the rail network is highly concentrated to bring that in. As we all know, when you try and cross from east to west, it just doesn't work. One of the intriguing things, though, has been that we had kind of maxed out. People were commuting in from Bristol, people were commuting in from Grantham, and that was absurd anyway. Now we're starting to see people being employed in Sunderland and places, and their attitude is, I wouldn't have taken a job in London, but I only have to go to London once every 2 weeks. So, are they London workers, et cetera, to underscore your point there. Intriguingly, I think the audience would like to move on to politics. Can you believe that? Sorry, economics, can you believe it? Clive Bullen isn't a large drop in the housing market highly likely, given how much interest rates have gone up? And will this be a big economic driver of how people feel in the coming years?
I think yes. I think that's completely right. I was actually talking to somebody about this yesterday. Weaning people off. We haven't weaned people off an era of cheap money. It sort of happened overnight. And that shock and just the sheer cost is going to be really shocking for people. And I think house prices are going to be under immense pressure next year. That's just, for me, it's pretty obvious when you look at the numbers. Obviously, underneath those numbers, it'll depend where. So, for example, if you're looking at London prime, let's say more than 10 or 15 million pounds, I suspect those will be in high demand, because if you're taking the US dollar, you've gained 30% on the pound before the fact that the United States economy is doing a lot better than British or European. So, in fact, if you're people coming in dollars at the top end, I can imagine actually those house prices might do okay. But more broadly, I think that will be of huge significance. Huge significance. What do I think the consequences of that going to be? I think that it will be not good for people on fixed incomes who are older, who have benefited a lot from quantitative easing over the last 10, 12 years. I think it will be better for successful working age younger people who can afford to make their mortgage payments, because what you'll find is they'll be able to pick up the assets at a cheaper cost. So I can see that sort of distributional effect happening, rather than over the last 10, 12 years, we've just seen, older people with assets really benefit to the expense of others. I think that may go into reverse, but not without quite a lot of pain in the intervening period.
Yeah, I might add something into that. I mean, one of the problems in all of this is it a high rate, is money cheap or is money expensive, but it's also the volatility element. So we've seen in the last week, of course, because of the volatility, as opposed to the rates being high or low, they won't get mortgages because people are pulling those mortgage products down. They don't see how they can offer them sensibly in an environment that is this volatile. We've got Hugh Purser here with, if politics is about economics, then politics is also about economic ideology. Almost you need to have an ideology to be a politician. And is there a mismatch between politicians' perspectives and voters' perspectives here?
Mismatch in what way?
Well, I think what Hugh is emphasizing is, if you're a politician, we buy your argument, I can see where it's going, I'm thinking economics all the time. The voters don't really do quite the same thing. They're sort of looking at it as we opened, that it's politics is much wider than that.
Yes, and there is definitely a case that people, and I started by saying, people don't necessarily express everything in economic terms. I think it'd be quite strange if you did. When people move, they find a house of their dreams with their they're newlyweds, and they're looking around and they find the house of their dreams. Money comes into the conversation, but it's not the first thing people say. They say, oh gosh, I love the windows, or I love the view from the garden, or whatever it is. But underpinning that is actually a very cold economic judgment, which is, this is for our money that we have to spend, in economic terms, the best asset that we can buy, and why that view is wonderful, but that'll mean that other people find it wonderful, which will mean it will retain value in the market. Now, I'm being very cold about that, and I'm very glad my wife isn't listening to this, but I think that people can express things in ways that are spanning family, culture, history, even literature, all sorts of things. But my argument is that actually all of those things are being driven by economics, and what you've got to try and do in politics is to try and get the source of things rather than deal with the surface of things often. And actually, I was going to mention this in my talk, but I couldn't really find a way to put it in. What some people talk about as sort of woke, the sort of strong social justice element to today's politics, particularly around race, but not exclusively. This is where I think the theory becomes harder to explain, if I'm very honest, because it strikes me that what we're seeing with the death of religion, as religion sort of became less and less mass religion in Western societies over the last 60, 70 years, you've seen a growth in, as I say, what people would call woke ideology or societal discussion. I think a big part of that is actually a replacement of religion rather than anything else. I wouldn't put it necessarily on a political sphere any more than I put religion on a political sphere, because what I think is happening is that the human desire for something transcendental that goes beyond this world, and to feel good about something just for the sake of it being a good thing to do or to be, is still there. It just used to be provided by the church, or in a Muslim country by Islam, but these days for more and more people is being provided by a sort of social ideology that is permeating culture, and that I would put in almost a religious box rather than a more traditional political box.
Okay. Arthur Palmer wonders, if you have this emphasis on economics, how do you balance cultural investigation with economic reform when you're creating policy? I mean, does policy get overly driven by economics under this because the politicians are closer to the policy creation and therefore they're focused on economics for vote purposes, but it might not actually develop culturally a better society?
So as a criticism of me personally, I take that completely. And of course, it's possible that, I focus on the things that I understand better. So, there is, and I'm more than willing to take that criticism. But I'd say more generally, politicians don't actually think about economics all that much at all. Actually, I think my colleagues broadly, let's take levelling up. Levelling up has been, over the last couple of years, much more described in terms of cultural and historical factors, right? How many times you read an article talking about, the importance of place, or the fact that we should, think about the history of parts of the North and their industrial heritage and all these things, which are all very important, and people really care about them. But they're not primarily economic descriptions or drivers, because I think most politicians are like most voters. They think often that, well, politics is about a bunch of things. And as I say, it is. But at core, I think it's been driven by economics. I think it's probably one of the reasons why a lot of policy solutions which look good, that should work, don't end up working, because they aren't actually rooted in sound economics. And they're rooted in a perception of what people want or what they need, but actually doesn't actually come true in the end.
Yeah. We're going to close in a few minutes. I've just opened the poll to see if the audience has changed their minds in any way. So folks, just a quick one there. Is politics all about economics and culture? You've heard Bim for 35 minutes, and I think he has made a very cogent and compelling case. And I'm just leaving that open, Bim. If it goes the way it looks, this is going to be interesting. All right, I think we're ready to just shut that, folks. Do quickly hit your buzzer. Fantastic, here we go. And I'll just share that result. And Bim, if this was a competition, you've definitely shifted something like 21% of the audience over to your side. So well done you, if I may say. But I had a couple of questions.
That looks like a sort of, Labour versus Conservative poll at the moment. So that's good.
Well, Rupert Stubbs is pointing me to the recent graphs in the FT showing how out of step the party may well be with the voters, but that's another story, I think. Just a quick one from me. Really, Andrew Churchill is pointing out as well on the overall question of whether or not we actually kind of outsource even further on a virtual economy. Perhaps London's traditional time zone means that we'll be outsourcing to Harare rather than Hyderabad, but that's a nice comment there, Andrew. Bob McDowell is curious, is if your philosophy is correct in respect of the West, does this affect the position of Western relationships with the rest of the world?
It probably does, but in order to make that judgment, you need a better understanding than I do about the internal societal workings of, say, India or even China. You know, I mean, I spent a bit of time in China, and you know, China, in some level, is like the most capitalist place you could ever possibly be. Much more so than Europe, actually. But then, in another sense, they're obviously they're a communist country. They have a strong faith, most people, in the Communist Party and its value, and to them, Confucianism plays a huge role societally. You know, I just don't know enough to be able to make a judgment as to how different we would be from, say, a country like China or indeed India.
I'm going to exercise chairman's prerogative. I'd like to bring up two quick points in closing where I'd be interested in your thoughts. I mean, starting with the very basic on your thesis that status is economic. You know, it's interesting. In fact, if you read David Graeber's Debt the First 5,000 Years, he points out, in fact, all money was status and became economic, not the other way around. Does this argue, though, that in fact we should be looking at other ways of establishing status? I mean, some of the bit about the vicar was it wasn't just that he wasn't worried about money; he also had a nice house in the village. If you see me. Before we used to pay for honors, actually they were status symbols, you know, that you couldn't buy. You had to earn it by being respected by the community. To some degree, before degrees were bound up as actually increasing your income, which they didn't if we go back about a century and a bit. They were things that, oh, this is Dr. Afolami, and that's a respected position. So should we be perhaps seeking to reestablish other forms of status to calm down this overemphasis on economics?
I think we should. I think it's very, very dangerous to give social or social power to those who also have economic power. I think that's a very dangerous situation. The best situation overall is where those two things are completely divorced. It's actually one of the reasons why the monarchy always has to be very careful. Though the monarchy is obviously, you know, they've got palaces and they go to place, you know, state visits and dinners and all this sort of stuff. They can't be too apart from everybody else in terms of income. You know, you wouldn't want to hear of monarchs behaving like, for example, you might see with certain monarchies in the Middle East, for example. That would not go down well here. There's a sort of acceptance that yes, they have this position, but they've got to use that position, not flaunt wealth, not be extreme in that sense. And there's a sort of unwritten deal on that. I think you're completely right. I think that unless people feel that they have sufficient status, the only thing they can drive at is money. And if the only thing people will drive at is money, so many good things that we love about the world and life and human beings just get crowded out. So really, I mean, I picked vicars. My grandfather was a vicar and very senior cleric in Nigeria. And I think that you just need there to be people in the community and in the country whose status is very high, but economically they don't exert a lot of power. I think that's very important.
Well, we're going to have to close in a second, and I'll make a remark of my own, which is I gave a lecture, one of my Gresham lectures a while back, and I looked at one of the effects of globalization was the inability to compare status except through economics. So, you know, I meet you, you're from Hong Kong, I explain to you that my children go to, you know, some Swiss school, you don't even know what the name of the school is. you tell me your kids are going to Hong Kong High School, and I think, well, that's great, but it turns out Hong Kong High School is the hothouse school of the century, but I don't know that. You explain that you're a member of the jockey club. I talk about my golf club. Neither of us have got any clue what our relative status is to each other. And then suddenly you explain to me that you're worth $50 million. Now I've got it. You see, this is one of the issues. And I think what's been great today, Bim, and honestly, I really appreciate your thoughtful approach to this and coming on board at such an interesting time. And I'd love to talk to you privately about your career and the party and the politics, because you always have some great insights. But I think one of the enduring things at the moment is we sit here in an economy where we can't seem to fix our potholes. We seem to be supposedly underfunded in the NHS. We supposedly have to cut our missions abroad down. We can't put airplanes on our aircraft carriers. We're unable to do all sorts of things. And yet we're supposedly the sixth richest country in the world. So why, if we're so rich, do we feel so poor? We could, I think, move quite handily into areas like productivity. But I think you're absolutely right that it's that economic status that also drives the figures there. And we do feel poor, and we do feel comparatively poor, and these do drive our behaviors. So thank you so much for these insights. If I may, I'm just going to do 3 quick rounds of thanks. Firstly, to our sponsors who, as ever, allow us to range widely. Secondly, to you, the audience, you've been particularly vibrant today, and I shall definitely be sending all of your comments with your emails to Bim if he wants to get back to you. And I would point to the forthcoming events. There is an event next Thursday, a physical event that's free if you're in the insurance industry and want to talk about smart bindings. But as ever, look online for the various events ahead. But my final thanks, Bim, has to come to you. I'm afraid we've been struggling over the last couple of years at FS Club to come up with suitable applause technology to thank you, but we now have our Korean karmic clapper, which has to substitute, I'm afraid, for the audience opening up the floodgates of applause. But it's been a delight having you. We'd really like to have you back, because I think you're one of the rising stars in a party that really needs quite a few. Thank you.
Thank you. Real pleasure. Thank you, Michael. See you soon.